Good day everyone, I am Fianna Monchano.
I am Kesha Lucy.
I am Janelle Emperelio.
And we are the reporters for today.
Are you one of those students who hate math, knowing that math is about numbers, sequences, and computation? But math is not always about computation, numbers, or sequences, but also about patterns. In Ian Stewart's Natures of Numbers, math proves us that also natures show its complexity. It's not as simple as we think. And for today's video, we will be discussing Chapter 9 of Ian Stewart's Nature's Number. But before we proceed to our discussion, let's have a game first. So let's begin.
For the first set of photo, to answer, just comment down below and we will check it later.
And for the second set, and lastly, the third set. From the answer that you have given, we will be discussing today the Chapter 9 of Ian Stewart, Nature's Number, entitled Drop, Dynamics, and Daisies. For the first part, Miss Kesha Lucy will discuss the drop, Miss Janelle Perelio will discuss the dynamics, and the third part, Daisies, will be discussed by Miss Monchano.
The ninth chapter of Ian Stewart's Nature's Numbers is really all about the numerical patterns in nature and how it is beautiful, symmetrical, and how they are perceived differently between geneticists and mathematicians. So as nature looks complex as everybody thinks, it's really not, because according to Ian Stewart, it perceived differently by other people.
Chaos theory has all sorts of implication, but the one Stewart closes on is this: the world is not chaotic. If anything, it is boringly predictable. And at the level of basic physics and maths, the law which seems to underpin it are also schematic and simple. And yet, what we are only really beginning to appreciate is how complicated things are in the middle. It is as if nature can only get from simple laws like Newton's incredibly simple law of thermodynamics to fairly simple outcomes or the orbit of the planets via almost incomprehensibly complex processes. To end, Stewart gives us 3 examples of the way apparently simple phenomena in nature derive from stupefying complexity. What exactly happens when a drop of water falls off a tap? Computer modeling of the growth of fox and rabbit populations. Why petals on flowers are arranged in numbers derived from the Fibonacci sequence. In all 3 cases, the underlying principle seems to be resolvable into easily stated laws and functions, and in our everyday lives, we see water dropping off taps or flower heads all the time. And yet, the intermediate steps between simple mathematical principles and real-world embodiment turn out to be mind-bogglingly complex.
The first case study of Ian Stewart is the drop or the water drop. The water drop is basically where everyone thinks that it is the shape of the teardrop, but it's actually not, where in reality, it has been in many literature that drop is not a semicircular. In 1990, Howell Peregrine and colleagues at Bristol University photographed the process of water droplets. His contribution was mainly like fluid mechanics, water waves, and coastal engineering. So either way, he did something what we call the water droplet illustration. Okay, what we see here right now is that the root of the water slowly detaches from its root, and as it falls, it turns into a teardrop shape. And then as it falls down continually, it will turn into a spear, and that spear will also falls down. So now, we can observe that the spear falling down and detaching from its root is that a small thread can be seen, and that thread can be defined as a formation in which it connects through the droplet.
Dynamics. The use of that phrase reflects a long tradition of mathematical modeling in which the changes in populations of interacting creatures are represented by differential equations. Pig or truffle system was an example. However, there is a lack of biological realism in such models, and not just as regards my choice of creatures. In the real world, the mechanism that governs population sizes is not a law of population. Newton's law of motion, there are all kinds of other effects. For example, random ones, or can the pig dig out the truffle, or is there a rock in the way? Or types of variability not included in the equations. Or some pigs habitually produce more piglets than others. In 1994, Jackie McLeod, David Rand, and Howard Wilson of Warwick University carried out a fascinating study that bears on the relation between more biologically realistic models and the traditional equations. It follows a strategy common in complexity theory. Set up a computer simulation in which large numbers of agents interact according to biologically plausible, though much simplified, rules, and try to extract large-scale patterns from the results of that simulation. In this case, the simulation was carried out by means of a cellular automaton, which you can think of as a kind of mathematical computer game. McLeod, Rand, and Wilson, lacking my bias in favor of pigs, considered the more traditional foxes and rabbits. The computer screen is divided into a grid of squares, and each square is assigned a color, say red for a fox, gray for a rabbit, green for grass, black for bare rock. Then a system of rules is set up to model the main biological influences at work. Example of such rules might be, if a rabbit is next to grass, it moves to the position of the grass and eats it. If a fox is next to a rabbit, it moves to the position of the rabbit and eats it. At each stage of the game, a rabbit breeds new rabbits with some chosen probability. A fox that has not eaten for a certain number of moves will die. McLeod's group played a more complicated game than this, but you can get the idea. Each move in the game takes the current configuration of rabbits, foxes, grass, rocks, and apply the rules to generate the next configuration, tossing computer dice when random choices are required. The process continues for several thousand moves, an artificial ecology that plays out the game of life on a computer screen. This artificial ecology resembles a dynamical system in that it repeatedly applies the same bunch of rules, but it also includes random effects which places the model in a different mathematical category altogether, that of stochastic cellular automata computer games with chances. Precisely because of the ecology is an artificial one, you can perform experiments that are impossible or too expensive to perform in a real ecology. You can, for example, watch how the rabbit population in a given region changes over time and get the exact numbers. This is where McLeod's group made a dramatic and surprising discovery. They realized that if you look at too tiny a region, what you see is largely random. For example, what happens on a single square looks extremely complicated. On the other hand, if you look at too large region, all you see is the statistics of the population averaged out. On intermediate scales, though you may see something less dull, so they develop a technique for finding the size of region that would provide the largest amount of interesting information. They then observe a region of that size and recorded the changing rabbit population. Using methods developed in chaos theory, they asked whether that series of numbers was deterministic or random, and if deterministic, what its attractor looked like. This may seem a strange thing to do, in as much as we know that the rules for the simulation build in a great deal of randomness, but they did it anyway. found was startling. Some 94% of the dynamics of the rabbit population on this intermediate scale can be accounted for by deterministic motion on a chaotic attractor in four-dimensional phase space. In short, a differential equation with only four variables captures the important features of the dynamics of the rabbit population with only a 6% error despite the far greater complexities of the computer game model. This discovery implies that models with small numbers of variables may be more realistic than many biologists have assumed. Its deeper implication is that simple large-scale features can and do emerge from the fine structure of complex ecological games. Population dynamics refers to the way in which the size and the age structures of populations change over time and the characterizations of the change in mathematical terms. A population describes a group of individuals of the same species occupying a specific area at a specific time. Some characteristics of a population that are of interest to biologists include the population density, the birth rate, and the death rate. If there is immigration into the population or emigration out of it, then the immigration rate and emigration rate are also of interest. Together, these population parameters or characteristics describe how the population density changes over time. The ways in which population densities fluctuate, increasing, decreasing, or both over time, is a subject of population dynamics. For example, the abundance of a given species, for example a snail, might be controlled by the abundance of organisms that have a negative effect on the species of interest, such as competitors, predators, and diseases. Population dynamics, particularly in the context of persistent inequalities, will have major influence on development processes and on the inclusive and balanced growth and outcomes in the coming decades. They also change the capacity of countries to achieve broad-based development goals. Population dynamics is one of the fundamental areas of ecology, forming both the basis for the study of more complex communities and of many applied questions. Understanding population dynamics is the key to understanding the relative importance of competition for resources and predation in structuring ecological communities, which is central question in ecology. Population dynamics plays a central role in many approaches to preserving biodiversity, which until now may have been primarily focused on a single species approach. The calculation of the intrinsic growth rate of a species from a life table is often the central piece of conservation plans. Similarly, management of natural resources such as fishery depends on the population dynamics as a way to determine appropriate management actions.
And for the third and final example of Ian Stewart's Natures of Number, which is Daisies, the key question for this chapter is if genetics can choose to give a flower any number of petals it likes, or a pine cone any number of scales that it likes, why do we observe such preponderance of Fibonacci numbers, a mathematical regularity of nature that emerged from complexity rather than having been built in with the rules, is the number of petals of flowers. The majority of plants have a number of petals taken from the series 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, and 89. The view of conventional biologists is that the flower's genes specify all such information. However, just because living organisms have complicated DNA sequences that determine which proteins they are made of and so on, it doesn't follow that genes determine everything. And even if they do, they may do so only indirectly. For example, genes tells plant how to make chlorophyll, but they don't tell the plants what color the chlorophyll has to be. If it's chlorophyll, it's green. There's no choice. So some features of the morphology of living creatures are genetic in origin and some are a consequence of physics, chemistry, and the dynamics of growth. One way to tell the difference is that genetic influences have enormous flexibility, but physics, chemistry, and dynamics produce mathematical regularities. They form the beginning of the so-called Fibonacci series, in which each number is the sum of the two that precede it. Petals aren't the only places you find Fibonacci numbers either. If you look at a giant sunflower, you find a remarkable pattern of florets, tiny flowers, that eventually become seeds in its head. The florets are arranged in two intersecting families of spirals, one winding clockwise, the other counterclockwise. In some species, the number of clockwise spirals is 34, and the number of counterclockwise spirals is 55. Both are Fibonacci numbers occurring consecutively in the series. Same with pineapples. It have 8 rows of scales, the diamond-shaped markings sloping to the left and 13 sloping to the right. Leonardo Fibonacci, in about 1200, he invented his series in a problem about the growth of population of rabbits. It wasn't as realistic a model of rabbit population dynamic as the Game of Life model, but it was a very interesting piece of mathematics. Nevertheless, because it was the first model of its kind and because mathematicians find Fibonacci numbers fascinating and beautiful in their own right. French mathematical physicist Stephanie Dody and Yves Coder, they devised a theory of the dynamics of plant growth and used computer models and laboratory experiments to show that it accounts for the Fibonacci patterns. The human eye picks out the Fibonacci spirals. Fibonacci spirals are formed from primordia that appear near each other in space, but it is the sequence in time that really matters. Successive primordia. Successive angles are pretty much equal. Their common value is called the divergence angle. In other words, the primordia are equally spaced in an angular sense along the generative spiral. Moreover, the divergence angle is usually very close to 137.5 degrees, a fact first emphasized in 1837 by the crystallographer Auguste Bravais and his brother Louis. The ratio of consecutive Fibonacci numbers gets closer and closer to the number 0.618034. For instance, 34 over 55 is equal to 0.6182, which is already quite close. The human eye picks out two families of interpenetrating spirals, one winding clockwise and the other counterclockwise, and because of the relation between Fibonacci numbers and the golden number, the numbers of spirals in the two families are consecutive Fibonacci numbers. Dody and Coder find out that divergence angle depends on the interval between drops according to a complicated branching pattern of wiggly curves. Each section of a curve between successive wiggles correspond to a particular pair of numbers of spiral. The main branch is very close to a divergence angle of 137.5 degrees, and along it you find all possible pairs of consecutive Fibonacci numbers, one after the other in numerical sequence. The gaps between branches represent bifurcations where the dynamics undergoes significant changes. In many plants, the rate of appearance of primordia can speed up or slow down. In fact, changes in morphology, whether a given primordium becomes a leaf or a petal, say often accompany such variations. So maybe what the genes do is affect the timing of the appearance of the primordia, but plants don't need their genes to tell them how to space their primordia. That's done by the dynamics. It's a partnership of physics and genetics, and you need both to understand what's happening. Key concept. Chaos teaches us that system obeying simple rules can behave in surprisingly complicated ways. Mathematical patterns in the natural world opens our eyes to features of nature that we would not otherwise have appreciated. So mathematics helps us to deepen our understanding about nature's complexity.
artificial ecology perform experiments that are impossible or too expensive to perform in a real ecology. Not that nature is complicated. No, nature is, in its own subtle way, simple. However, those simplicities do not present themselves to us directly. Instead, nature leaves clues for the mathematical detectives to puzzle over. So that's what we learn from mathematics. It only gives clues for us to deeply understand the complexity of our environment